Uh, Good afternoon and welcome to the Colloquium. Today's lecture is by an archaeologist. Her name is Dr. Supriya Varma. I need to give a little bit of an introduction to Supriya, which will partly be personal, because Supriya and I have known each other. We are meeting after a long time, but we both knew each other when we were students like you, in our masters in MPhil. We were studying together and we did our first excavation together. After that, I stopped being an archaeologist and Supriya went on to become an archaeologist. Now, when we think of archaeology, we usually think of excavations alone and of dramatic kinds of information. But what Supriya is going to deal with and engage with today is a theme that actually interests and is of concern to students of development, given our focus on working with people, participatory approaches. So this is the kind of theme that she will be talking on. I request Supriya to come.
So thank you, Kundendu and Chandan, for inviting me here. It is, I must admit, a challenge. You know, we archaeologists are used to generally speaking to other archaeologists, and we take it as a given that whatever jargon we are using, it is going to be understood. Now, I did a little bit of checking up, and I realized there is possibly, forget archaeology, not even any history that is taught here. So I wouldn't really even dare start talking about hardcore archaeology. And it's also coincidental that this is a paper which has actually jointly been written by my colleague Jaya Menon, who's also here, and we have over the years corroborated on many other projects as well. And this came up because there's another colleague of mine, Smriti, who is also present here, who is part of the heritage group at NIAS. She is organizing a panel at the European Association of South Asian Archaeology on issues related to pedagogy, heritage, community archaeology, etc. So this is actually my very recent endeavor in this field, and I'm actually using you all as like sort of guinea pigs trying out whether what I say makes any sense to all of you. So please pardon me if I am incoherent, please tell me, and because the idea is to get across to an audience not just comprising of archaeologists, but the larger public, as it were. Now, I will begin with an Indian Express report which came out on 12th January 2018, which mentioned about this Harappan site of Rakhigadi in Haryana. Now, Harappan civilization, I think most people in South Asia are aware of. This is a very early civilization. It's one of the 3 Bronze Age civilizations along with Egypt and Mesopotamia. And there is this site, very large site. They claim it's one of the largest sites, even larger than Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, and it is in the state of Haryana, in Hisar district. Now, after having been excavated by the ASI, and then subsequently by the ASI together with Deccan College, another premier institute for archaeology, the site seems to have hit headlines for a reason other than for what it has archaeologically revealed. The excavations have actually become a bone of contention between the villagers, the archaeologists, and the state. The twin villages of Rakhi Shahpur and Rakhi Khas are together known as Rakhigadi. The Rakhigadi Sangharsh Samiti has been formed and says that it is no longer interested in the excavations, if it means they will be displaced from their homes. The cause for concern lies in the eviction notices that have been sent by the ASI to 201 villages. The ASI says that the villagers have encroached upon the protected area on the various mounds and raised unauthorized and illegal constructions within the notified protected area. Now, there is this scheme where sites that are considered to be very, very important, they are declared protected area. So you can have centrally protected, state protected, and then unprotected. Now this is considered to be of national importance, so this is centrally protected. The Samiti has been supported by the Rakhi Bara Cup. And you would be aware of these Cup panchayats that exist in Haryana and other states. A group of 12 cups with 17 villages under them. Suresh Kot of the Rakhi Bara Cup says, and I'm quoting him, "There are sites here of local deities, old ponds, and temples which are a source of faith for us. How can we leave this place? We have already given up 50 acres of land for historical excavation. Now, why are they, that is the authorities, adamant to dig the entire village? Why can't they scan the entire village with the help of satellites? Such is their faith in science, remote sensing, etc. How has this situation come to be? Now here I want to flag that such a conflict is not specific to South Asia alone. The construction of dam on the Black Volta River at Bui in Khana to generate about 400 megawatts of hydroelectric power engendered conflict in 2007 between 3 project-affected communities, that is the Bui, Archaeological and Dokukaina, and the Bui Power Authority, that is BPA, the managers of the dam. The members of the communities had opposed plans by the BPA to resettle them without making provision for what they regarded as the souls of the communities, including deities and ancestral remains. This conflict had the potential to halt the power generating process and the project's schedule altogether. Timely completion of the project and the generation of power in 2013 became possible only after a team of archaeologists from the University of Ghana and a representative of the Ghana Museums and Monument Board intervened and successfully mediated and resolved the conflict. The team carried out a survey to study and salvage some archaeological remains of old middens associated with the settlements. The team also lobbied and negotiated with the BPA on behalf of the affected communities to exhume and relocate ancestral shrines, as well as shrines of deities and other features. And in fact, on the slide, you can see the relocation taking place. All these were identified as vital heritage properties by elders of the communities, without which the communities would not relocate. Abandoning these properties to be inundated by floodwaters of the dam would, according to the elders, be a sacrilege they would not condone. Thus, while maintaining the scientific work, archaeology can play a major role in the negotiation and resolution of human rights and cultural heritage-related conflicts among affected communities associated with large-scale developmental projects. Now, commissioning of the dam has not ended the work of archaeologists in the dam project area. The team of archaeologists has recommended the establishment of a memory center by the BPA within the resettlement township where items recovered from excavated and ethnographic contexts during the archaeology project as well as relevant visual documents could be housed and displayed. The center is expected to enhance preservation of the local people's culture and cultural heritage and stimulate heritage tourism in the area. Increasingly, school children and domestic and international tourists have begun visiting the dam site where they are given guided tours. Most often, the tourists are driven through the resettlement community just to be shown new houses and layout of the community. What is lacking is a community museum or a memory center that can deepen visitors' knowledge and understanding of the dam project and of the life of resettled people before and after the dam was constructed. Besides the touristic appreciation of the cultural heritage of the communities, the young children in the community and the community cluster of schools will use the resources at the museum to enhance teaching and learning of Ghanaian history and cultures of the local people. Now, closer home, I can cite the cases of the Maheshwar hydroelectric project and the Narmada Sarovar Dam project. In July 1998, activists who were protesting against these projects approached Jaya Menon and me to survey the area between Barwaha and Barwani along the Narmada River in order to assess the heritage, the archaeological heritage that would be affected. The report that was prepared was submitted to the Madhya Pradesh government in August 1998. It was probably thrown in the dustbin or is still lying submerged underneath the layers of dust in some government department in Bhopal. Apart from a report, recommendations had also been made by SP Ota of the Prehistory Branch Archaeological Survey of India at Nagpur in 1992. And you can see the kind of recommendations that he made. There were extensive recommendations which were made, most of which were not followed through. Now, in South Asia, local communities most often live near or amidst archaeological places. Their lives are in many ways framed and structured by these places. At the same time, these places too are deeply impacted by the communities that live nearby. This symbiotic relation is often ruptured by the high population density in the Indian subcontinent, particularly in the Gangetic plain of North India. The pressure to clear land for extending cultivation or for constructing homes for animals and humans directly affects the survival of archaeological sites. This pressure has resulted in the loss of several archaeological sites, particularly those of earlier periods where there is little structural evidence. This loss can be seen even with standing monuments that are so conspicuous on the landscape with people occupying them along with their animals. But as we can see with the case of Rakhigari, local people, their lives, their homes, their livelihoods can also be threatened by archaeological sites. How do we view the pressures of development and their impact on the archaeological heritage of the country? There is only so much that authorities of the state can do to protect archaeological sites. As we shall see, the state is primarily concerned with sites and monuments of quote-unquote national importance. Ideally, local communities must be involved in the protection of archaeological places. However, what happens when the local people in the vicinity or on an archaeological site have no association with that site other than it being just a piece of land? This story of preservation, conservation, and protection gets further complicated by legislative practices of preservation related to ancient monuments and archaeological sites, as well as the custodianship of antiquities and art treasures. In order to bring out the complexities of these issues, I will, in my presentation, be focusing on the archaeological site of Indor Khera in the upper Ganga plains of North India, which I surveyed and excavated along with Jaya Menon between 2004 and 2010. At the same time, I will flag instances in South Asia of possible forms of community involvements and the scope for public archaeology. Now, involvement of local communities forms the main thread of a relatively new field in archaeology studies, that of community archaeology. Marshall, in an article in a journal volume dedicated to the subject, has spelled out the kind of initiatives that local communities have taken in relation to the archaeological site they live near or associate with. The volume has flagged initiatives from Australia, North America, Africa, and Bangladesh. In the West, community archaeology has largely come within CRM, or what is called cultural resource management, or heritage management fields, rather than become the focus of academic endeavors. In South Asia, there is barely any recognition of such a field, while the challenges and potential are immense. Marshall points out that archaeologists begin by identifying a site they want to work with, and from that choice emerge two kinds of communities. One kind of community comprises those who live either on or in the vicinity of the site, and this is clearly the case with Rakhigari. A good example is the project at Qusir al-Qadim in Egypt at the Roman site of Myos Hormuz on the Red Sea. The underlying premise of the project is that it is no longer acceptable for archaeologists to reap the material and intellectual benefits of another society's heritage without that society being involved and able to benefit equally from the endeavor. The involvement of local communities, I quote, fosters respect for the value of the archaeological resource and thus discourages vandalism and the looting of sites, unquote. Collaboration between archaeologists and local communities comprises an ethical practice in archaeology, but should not remain as just that. But inputs by local communities should be of major importance to research questions. The second kind of community involves descendants that include those who can or choose to trace the descent from the people who once lived at the place that is in the present an archaeological site. Thus, collaboration with indigenous and descendant communities is necessary where those communities are directly affected by archaeological practices. It is no wonder that much of community archaeology in the World Archaeology volume focused on Australia, as the reality is that in many cases, archaeological sites in Australia are ancestral places of indigenous communities. This was apparent in a recent conference of the Australian Archaeological Association held in December 2017 in Melbourne. Every paper was prefaced by an invocation to the indigenous communities of the area where the archaeologists worked. And often a member of the indigenous community was involved in the archaeological project. But as is understandable, the relationship between archaeology and the indigenous community who own the site can also be fraught with tension. Along with community archaeology, where a fair amount of work has been done, there is also another subdiscipline that is developing within archaeology, and that is public archaeology. Now, I must say that this is both community archaeology and public archaeology are not subdisciplines that have really taken off in India. I mean, these are perhaps now some of the new kind of work which we hope Smriti has been involved to a certain extent, and I think we are also now getting involved. And in the years to come, I think it should pick up. Public archaeology is actually a subfield of archaeology that attempts to maintain the academic integrity of a discipline while conveying its central tenets to the public in an accessible, understandable, and ultimately enjoyable way. This kind of dissemination can be done through various media, radio talks, television shows, and other digital media. Other ways can also be, for instance, local people interested in the archaeological assets of a city, lobbying the city government to gain legislative protection, as happened in the case of St. Augustine in Florida. There have also been instances of outreach programs run by archaeologists in a country in which they are doing field work for students of different levels from school to college and university. It has become necessary to incorporate ethnographic research methods in a graduate level curricula to enable students to understand the power dynamics at play in their research, resulting in a more nuanced, public-focused practices. These are just a few instances of public archaeology that can be flagged. Now let's move to the legislation concerning protection of archaeological sites in India. The necessity of taking steps for the protection of monuments and relics of antiquity was impressed upon the government of India as way back as in 1898, so I'm talking about the colonial period. Legislation was thus required to enable the government to discharge its responsibilities, and a bill was drafted for the purpose, which eventually became passed as the Ancient Monuments Preservation Act 1904. The first portion of the bill dealt with the protection of ancient monuments, that is the concern of the present paper. Many of these were already known and under government control, but there were other private owners and falling into disrepair. The ambit of the bill was to bring these other monuments under the purview of legislation that would give the government the right, and I quote, to prevent injury to and preserve buildings buildings remarkable in their antiquity and for the historical or architectural value or required for the convenience of the public, unquote. The Act of 1904 hence gave the government rights of acquisition or guardianship of an ancient monument as spelled out in section 4, and enforcing preservation by the owners of monuments through agreements centering on maintenance, custody, and prevention of destruction. The law also gave the government the right to purchase land on which an ancient monument stood. Section 10 called for the compulsory purchase of ancient monument when it was apprehended that a protected monument was perceived in danger of being destroyed, injured, or allowed to fall into decay by using the Land Acquisition Act of 1894. Now, what we find is that the Act of 1904 had given wide powers to the collectors to enforce the government's position. After we gained independence, there is a new act which was framed, and that is the Ancient Monuments and Archaeological Sites and Remains Act 1958, that proposed to transfer some of the restrictive functions to the Director General of Archaeology, in other words, the center. So we are seeing basically a shifting from somewhat localized control, even at the hands of, say, under district collector, now moving entirely to the Director General. At the same time, the management of protected property in the case of village property was vested in the headman or other village officer. The 1958 Act deemed certain monuments to be of national importance and empowered the central government to declare monuments to be of national importance. Now, the 1958 Act was amended with the Ancient Monuments and Archaeological Sites and Remains Act 2010. Now, the statement of objects and reasons for the act are interesting. It states that the 1958 Act was enacted for the preservation of archaeological sites of national importance. But it says with the passage of time, the implementation of the provisions of the Act has become difficult, especially due to increase in population in the area surrounding the monuments and sites, which is detrimental to the safety and security of the monuments. So they're only talking about the monuments. There is no people in this whole legislative act. Besides, the penal provisions in the act are not stringent enough to provide effective deterrence. The 2010 Act was important also in laying down that a minimum of 100 meters in all directions of protected monuments would be the prohibited area for purposes of construction, and a minimum area of 200 meters that would be regulated. And we'll see in the case of Indor Khera how that plays out. The powers of protection and preservation also seem to have devolved on a new authority that was legislated, which is the National Monuments Authority. That was to grade and classify monuments and to oversee protection and to consider the impact of large-scale development projects that may be proposed in the regulated areas. The Act of 2010 also calls for the preparation of heritage bylaws in consultation with this body, which you may be aware of, the INTAC, the Indian National Trust for Arts and Cultural Heritage, for each protected monument and area. The 2010, interestingly, also did away with local powers of the headman or any other village officer, with all powers now devolving at the center. Thus, on the whole, it appears that over time, duties of protection have been increasingly taken away from the local authorities to centralized ones. The attempts of the state to marginalize heritage and protected monuments and, in effect, to undermine its own laws can be seen in the recent draft proposals put up on the ASI website. The Ancient Monuments and Archaeological Sites and Remains Bill 2016 seeks to amend the 1958 Act to make provision for allowing public works and projects essential for public in the prohibited area, and by public works, it means infrastructural works. And also, Section 20A, which deals with the declaration of prohibited area and carrying out of public works or other works in prohibited area, is now being sought to be amended. Now, according to the new guidelines being proposed, the issue of public works in prohibited areas will be referred to the National Monuments Authority for its recommendation, and this would be then forwarded to the central government. So the central government can decide whether they want to build a road next to the Taj Mahal or any other monument. So what we can see is that there is complete centralization of powers and the marginalization of even national level institutions that can be created in the first place to deal with issues of protection. Now, we can also have a look at some of the institutionalized conservation and protection initiatives. The Archaeological Survey of India was actually set up in the mid-19th century for survey and documentation of archaeological sites. Subsequently, conservation and protection of monuments and remains of national importance also came to be included within its ambit. Over the years, the ASI has realized that the challenge of protection and maintenance of numerous monuments and archaeological sites is far too great for them. They cannot manage it. And monuments and sites of national importance, or what the ASI protects, are a small fraction of what comprises the architectural heritage of the country. The majority of architectural heritage properties and sites in India still remain unidentified, unclassified, and unprotected, thereby subject to attrition on account of neglect, etc. And this has now become the purview of INTAC that was set up in 1984, which sees it necessary to value and conserve the unprotected architectural heritage. Now, a major initiative that makes a break with earlier practices of conservation and protection has been the work of this trust, that is the Aga Khan Trust for Culture, AKTC. The trust focuses on the physical, social, cultural, and economic revitalization of communities in the developing world. Their largest cultural project to date in India from 2004 has been the restoration and revitalization of Humayun's tomb, including its gardens. The significance of their work has been the empowering of local communities with the realization that conservation of monuments cannot be divorced from communities of people. The active involvement of local communities from the neighboring Nizamuddin area in the conservation project was critical to the success of this project. The revitalization expanded beyond the tomb to the neglected Sundar Nursery area with its numerous monuments and historic sections of West Nizamuddin. Now, the Aga Khan Trust practices of involving local people follow global trends. This has also more recently spurred the ASI to involve initiatives of involving the public in looking after the built heritage. From September 2017, the ASI has floated a scheme called Adopt a Heritage on the lines of a similar scheme first devised in Scotland. The idea for the Adopt a Monument scheme in Scotland was developed in the 1990s. Between 1991 and 1988, the Council for Scottish Archaeology, that is CSA, ran Adopt a Monument in response to the number of archaeological societies who wanted to look after and take responsibility for cultural heritage sites in the area. A second phase, that is from 2006 to 2009, was funded by the Historic Scotland and was intended as a pilot scheme to assess its popularity. The third phase is currently being helmed by the Archaeology Scotland. Adopt a Monument is a nationwide community archaeology scheme that provides volunteer groups with practical advice and training that they need to care and conserve their local heritage. The project encourages groups to get involved in hands-on activities to improve the condition, accessibility, and interpretation of the chosen site. In India, the Ministry of Tourism, in close collaboration with the Ministry of Culture and ASI, planned an Adopt a Heritage scheme with a view to, and I quote, developing heritage sites and making them tourist-friendly to enhance their tourism potential and cultural importance in a planned and phased manner. Now, unlike the Scottish case, which sought initiatives from volunteer groups, in India, I have a quote, expressions of interest have been invited from interested private/public companies and individuals interested in partnering with Ministry of Tourism, Ministry of Culture, and ASI for adopting heritage sites to provide, operate, and maintain world-class tourist facilities and amenities at the selected destinations. These companies or individuals who would adopt monuments would be called monument mitras. The scheme is to be first extended to 93 ASI ticketed monuments and then expanded to other sites of natural and cultural importance across India. The adoption for the purpose of providing basic amenities and for overseeing complete operations and maintenance would be for an initial period of 5 years and subject to regular monitoring and feedback. Now, conversations with Dr. Arun Raj of the ASI indicated that in Delhi, they were also interested in involving schools to adopt a monument in their vicinity. The aim is also to bring such initiatives within the Swachh Bharat scheme, as school students are expected to help keep the chosen monument clean. The ASI will also impart information to the students regarding the monument, which in turn they can disseminate to the public. Now, moving to the local, that is archaeology at the village of Indor Khera. While archaeological sites are often investigated, and that was the case with us also initially, that was our project all about, investigating the past. And this here you can see the mound of Indor Khera. What is usually neglected, particularly in South Asia, are issues related to the current social context of these sites. Indor Khera merited archaeological attention in its own stead and has been adequately published. It, however, becomes imperative to address some other questions, such as local perceptions to the mound and the daily negotiations of the local residents with the mound on which they live. The challenges of undertaking archaeological research at sites that are still inhabited by local communities, which is the case at Indor Khera, and the difficulties and hindrances in enforcing regulations and protection of archaeological places, such as Indor Khera, which is a centrally protected site. In the 19th century, the village occupied about 1/4 of the area, which has now expanded to over 2/3 of the mound. For the villagers of present-day Indor Khera, the archaeological mound is a reality and in many ways an obstacle that they have to tackle on a daily basis. This is a physical reality. The mound measures at its maximum a height of 17 meters from the surrounding plain. Families live all over the northern, the eastern, and the southern sides, and they have built the houses on top and the slopes of the mound. The edges of the mound, also slightly above plain level, are used for making temporary structures for housing animals such as buffaloes and cows. Thus, for all purposes, be it visiting other families or the post office or buying provisions, taking animals for pasturing, going to the fields or to the main road to leave Indor Khera would have meant climbing up and down the mound. By itself, this is not a huge enterprise. After all, there are people who live in upland villages who move in much the same way for all their daily needs. However, here is an alluvial plain that lies between the two major rivers of the Yamuna and the Ganga, and this hill is entirely artificial, built up by the detritus of millennia. Now, mounds in western Uttar Pradesh are locally known as khera. Past strata and remains are omnipresent to the villagers within their house plots and along the path that circumvents the mound. Interested visitors are shown the exposed sections of the mound. Villagers often point out things in the sections, such as bits of white, foamy, glassy slag, which they use for medicinal purposes. The mound also appears to have been mined for materials. Thus, the large bricks that are recovered from the early historic levels, early historic would be like 6th century BC to about 3rd century AD. They are often reused in present-day village house walls because these are much better constructed than the modern bricks. Our first archaeological forays at the site were for the purpose of surveying a 2 by 2 kilometer area around the site. This meant that we were traversing the fields of the villagers all around the mound, a highly visible activity from the mound's height. To any field archaeologist working in South Asia, this is a familiar scenario, and particularly so in a highly populous state such as Uttar Pradesh. South Asian fields are used for multiple purposes, and cropping is just one of those purposes. Suffice it to say that archaeological surveys in the fields of Indor Khera were perceived as bizarre and strange. Subsequent to the surveys, we obtained the license to excavate the site. Indor Khera was excavated for the first 2 years with the wheeler method of excavating in box and with the use of labor. In the last 2 seasons, we excavated without box but continued to use labor. Labor in Indian archaeological excavations usually comprises local villagers being inducted for the task. Locals have been involved since archaeological investigations began as part of the colonial endeavor in uncovering the Indian past. The formulation of gangs of labor, often from the nearby vicinity or village, was done for archaeological tasks. Wages were paid at Public Works Department, that is PWD, daily wage rates, and rosters were maintained for inducted labor. This practice still continues because the ASI excavates only with the help of hired labor. The ASI's Archaeological Works Code pays much attention to the maintenance of muster rolls, showing daily attendance and absence of laborers, certification of such rolls, and notifications of payments made on the basis of attendance. The ASI gives fieldwork grants to universities and research institutions at a percentage of the grants generated by the institutions involved, and these grants can only be used for the purpose of hiring labor. The use of hired labor in excavation is problematic from the point of view of training students. When hired labor is used, supervisors in the form of trained archaeologists or students under training usually stand at the edge of trenches and dictate what has to be done. All too often, ASI excavates using only 1 or 2 supervisors for dozens of trenches. In this case, hired labor to do all the work, even to the extent of deciding what is important to excavate, and often have been told to notify the archaeologists when a certain kind of artifact is recovered. One can well imagine that with the lack of observation, the context of archaeological finds is usually dispensed with. Students undertaking training learn to give orders but not to handle deposits, or learn how to excavate. We finally abandoned this practice of using hired labor when we subsequently excavated Rohana Khurd in Muzaffarnagar district of Uttar Pradesh. All trenches were then excavated by students who did every task, which included clearing of land to laying out of trenches, digging, documentation, photography, section and plan drawing, as well as cleaning ceramics and bones. Thus, the use of hired labor is an old archaeological practice in West and South Asia. Matthews mentions in the context of Mesopotamian archaeology, and I'm talking of Iraq, the work of Sherkatis, people from the village of Al-Sherkat, who had learned the difficult practice of recognizing and digging mud brick. The value in this ability is indicated by the fact that Sherkati workmen were taken to other Mesopotamian sites to excavate elsewhere. Workmen can recognize whether deposits are sterile or will have evidence of structures underneath, a practice recognized early on in archaeological practice and given the scientific name of bowsing. Locals also have great power of observation and eyes alert to the smallest artifact. You can see burned seeds being collected here by a workman at Indor Khera. Thus, burnt seeds, glass microbeads, and fish bones can be found while digging, but often it is the seed which helps us detect these. Now, what impact has archaeological intervention at Indor Khera had on the local population? First, because we excavated using labor, this had direct impact on the livelihood of the local people. Young men who normally migrate to Delhi for work found that they had an alternative in their own village. Thus, they could live at home and earn a living through the daily wages they received for their work at the site. That this was hugely desirable could be seen in the keenness of men. Women will not work only the men will work in North India, particularly in Western UP. This was hugely desirable, which could be seen in the keenness of men to be employed in the excavations and for queries requesting more fieldwork for several years, long after the excavations had ended. Like many other inhabited archaeological sites, these excavations have entered the social memory of the local people. The site also entered the archaeological literature after a gap of over 100 years. The impact of this was that the ASI put up their blue boards marking protection and prohibition of construction in the 100-meter vicinity. This has had a somewhat detrimental impact on the local villagers, as they are now prevented from even repairing their houses and digging in their house plots. Part of this has to do with the local politics playing as different parts of the village are occupied by different caste groups. Interestingly, the highly built-up areas of the mound closer to the main road are dominated by the higher caste groups, while the socially subordinated groups live in the western parts of the mound, areas that can still be excavated. Now, admittedly, the mound is getting cut at the edges due to the intervention of villagers, yet the site has survived surprisingly well for the past 125 years. To what do we attribute this survival? Part of the reason is to do with the fact that so much brick was used in construction that too much clearance of brick would be required in order to clear the land for cultivation. Many of the smaller mounds in the vicinity of the main mound have also survived, as we can see here, for the same reason. The main mound is too large to cut away and hence has survived. However, part of the mound in the southwestern side was cut away by a bulldozer to create a primary health center for the village. It is ironic that even though Indor Khera is a centrally protected site, another arm of the state sees no issue in violating its own rules. At the same time, we must remember sites such as the Siruthavur near Chennai in Tamil Nadu that has survived as a large area with several individual megalithic burials only because these are in a reserved forest area. The same complex has some burials outside the reserved forest area where the present village stands, and these are fast disappearing. So the question is, what is the way forward? There may be many reasons for the preservation of archaeological places in different parts of India. The most obvious is where the monuments and archaeological remnants can be commercialized through tourism. This has been the route taken in Rajasthan with the preservation of local havelis into hotels. The structures themselves have survived and will continue to survive, although in a highly commoditized fashion. Sites can survive for other reasons, as in the case of Rohanakhud. The archaeological mound is located about 200 meters to the southeast of Rohanakhud village and is locally known as Indor Khera or Khera Khel Ashram. This was a small rural settlement from the 4th to 1st centuries BCE with a gap in occupation, followed by reoccupation from the 4th to 10th centuries CE. Possibly around 11th century CE, this settlement was abandoned. At some later point, part of the mounded area began to be used as a burial space, and more recently, for ritual purposes. The top of the mound is occupied by structures that are mainly religious in nature, and apart from 3 main temples on the top of the mound, there are several smaller whitewashed temples or shrines that have been erected recently by the residents of the modern village in memory of their deceased ancestors. At present, these structures cover almost 30% of the mound, and the number is continuously increasing. Other than the temples, there is a rectangular priest house with a cemented brick veranda, which also exists. And on top of the mound are rudimentary brick paths that lead to the temples. On the western edge of the mound, there is a Muslim cemetery, which occupies a small area, which possibly could date to late medieval or early modern, and has been used till recent times. Near the edges of the mound, a circular jogging track for training local athletes has been constructed. And a lot of eucalyptus trees have also been planted along the jogging track. Fields occupy some of the mounded area that could have been leveled. So we find that long after the mound was abandoned, it continued to be used both in the medieval past as well as in the present, thereby ensuring that it survived. There can also be an emotional connect between local communities and archaeological sites, where the latter are seen as ancestral sites. This would be the case especially in northeastern India, where the present-day megalithic practices in relation to the dead have survived over several decades. Our older remains identified with ancestors or with ritual remain protected. In Kerala, for example, in South India, where megaliths are associated with sacred groves, these tend to survive as compared with those burials that are in the open. Similarly, at Siruthavur in Tamil Nadu, local people associate with a nearby Chola period temple that is still used and is part of the cultural landscape. Recent efforts to conserve the temple wholly with local resources show the close links of the people with the temple. As a result, not only the temple, but inscriptions on its walls will also continue to survive. However, when these factors are not present, local communities are often not vested in preserving archaeological sites. How does one create meaning out of an archaeological site for local people? At Indor Khera, the mound is not seen as part of their past. Indeed, several people have, in the memory of their forefathers, come to this village from elsewhere. The strata that they see and what they find when they dig do not resonate with them, other than a recognizable artifact similar to those used in the present, for example, pieces of pottery or bead from a necklace. The mound is seen as created by an upheaval with everything having turned upside down. And yet, it is a moment of revelation when structures just like theirs, for example, here you can see in the slide, are recovered in the excavation. At the same time, this revelation will not lead to the preservation of archaeological remains. Thus, the archaeological site then only becomes relevant to the local population at the short-term level during excavation by providing livelihood, or in the long term through the creation of a museum or the incorporation of those remains in a tourist circuit. This may work for a Dholavira or a Rakhigari, these are major Harappan sites, but will certainly not work for a site like Indor Khera. However, at the same time, as we have seen with Rakhigari, remnants of the past now have become a threat to the local villagers. Is it then education that can enable the protection of archaeological sites such as Indor Khera? Education, particularly at the primary level, has the scope of involving and alerting children to their environments, whether it be the natural environment or an ancient built one. Some of us had made an effort to make textbooks at the middle school level more inclusive. However, the challenge lies with school textbooks that are uniform over a highly diverse country. One textbook cannot, for example, address issues of the Northeast as well as areas of the Gangetic Plains or the Western coasts. The other way is that school teachers at the local level explain issues with local examples, but as we all know, the state of education in much of India's villages is far from admirable. Since archaeology is not taught as a separate discipline, either in schools or at the undergrad and postgrad level, barring some exceptions, there is an unfamiliarity with its methods and ambit. Thus, extracurricular workshops are one manner of outreach to familiarize students at different levels, both in metropolitan cities as well as towns and villages. We can take the case of Suthari on the Hindran River in Ghaziabad district of Uttar Pradesh to show the importance of local initiatives. The efforts made by a young man, Yogesh Kumar Yadav, to bring the archaeological remains and the need for its conservation to the attention of every institution that he could think of. The UP State Department, the ASI, the INTAG, and so forth are truly remarkable. He specifically contacted ASI, both the Delhi and the Agra circles, as well as Jaya and me in early 2014. We then visited the site on 8th March 2014. Our reconnaissance survey revealed 3 mounds, one which is occupied by the present village. Of the other 2, one near the river known as Bhadona. Tila is being found but is practically intact. This revealed sherds of painted black ware and black slip ware in the lower portions. and red wares from the surface indicating that it could be dated perhaps from about 1000 BCE to about 300 CE. The third mound, Devla Tila, furthest from the river, has almost completely been cut away due to soil digging. This reveals sherds of large storage jars and other vessels, and we could date it from about 300 to about 1100 CE, so it kept shifting. A very small portion of this mound survives due to a temple being located here. Yogesh has subsequently set up the Hindan Ghati Sabhyata Sanrakshan Evam Vikas Samiti in Suthari village. He is trying to develop river tourism on the Hindan and a historical circuit that will feed into that tourism endeavor. He's educated, and that may account for the effort in alerting the local population and talking to professional archaeologists. But the fact remains that the perception of the archaeological past as valuable is the only way to ensure the preservation of such remains. The challenge, and I conclude here, lies in formulating ways of involving local communities in the preservation of archaeological sites in South Asia. Article 51A F of the Indian Constitution states, and I quote, "It shall be the duty of every citizen of India to value and preserve the rich heritage of a composite culture." While this is an admirable insertion in our Constitution, the ground reality is starkly different. What I have argued is that the survival of archaeological sites is largely dependent on two factors. Either there is a direct emotional connect between the local communities and the archaeological remains, where the latter are seen as ancestral sites, or where monuments and remains continue to be used for ritual and other daily practices. Thus, going back to where I started with Rakhigari, the Harappan site may be vitally important to archaeologists, but has little meaning for the local residents. For the latter, the reality is that the places marked by local deities, ponds, and temples at Rakhigari are far more significant than the Harappan remains. Thank you.
Good afternoon, I'm Siddhant. It was an interesting talk. And so you'd find it funny, but so I'm here to draw some points from your research because the work currently I'm doing is also very similar to this. Although I'm working in the buffer zones of Bannerghatta National Park, and the situation we face there is very similar. I mean, this is archaeological site, but that's a national park. But again, but the way people and the park interacts is very similar. So I was hoping to draw some points from your research. One of the points that you raised in your talk was that when the blue warning signboards were put in the village, people felt intimidated. So did you see some kind of a hierarchy of change in land use? I mean, so for example, what we see in our national park area is that when the law is very stringently applied, the buffer zone law on the people, the first people who are impacted are the small farmers who tend to get apprehensive about if they'll be able to get full economic value of the land and sell it to real estate developers. So did you see this kind of a transition in this region as well, where due to the law there was a land use change from, say, agricultural land use to real estate, or any other way in which, broadly?
See, here, what we are talking about are houses of the local villagers on top of the mound, right? And these boards have really been put at the center of the mound, and then they measure 100 meters and then 200 meters. Okay, so it is not as though there is any kind of land use change in terms of agricultural practices. It is really the residential properties that we are talking of. But what happens with this 100-meter clause is that, and the way it is playing out in the case of Indor Khera is more to do with the local politics. So there is, I mean, first of all, I think we are partly because we excavated Indor Khera, suddenly it came into the limelight. And the ASI suddenly discovered, oh, here's a centrally protected site. And the mound is actually on a daily basis, the edges of it are being cut. And so they better put up all these boards. Now, what happens is that when there is enmity, say, between two households, one of them then goes and complains at Delhi ASI office. And the way it affects them is that for them it's a question of daily survival, because if it is within the 100 meters, they cannot even carry out repair work. So if, for example, the roof is leaking, they need to get permission from the Archaeological Survey of India to change the tiles or the tin that is part of their, so it becomes very, very difficult in this kind of a situation for ASI to be so officious and send out these letters without really talking to the people and how best to manage it. That is what I was trying to highlight. And it then, this is what, the same thing they have done at Rakhigarhi, is that they have decided that Rakhigarhi is a very important archaeological site. This is going to be developed as a major tourist venture. They're going to build a museum over there. And so we need to get all these 200 families out and relocated somewhere else. I mean, they've been living there for hundreds of years, and they have other emotional connect. Like, for them, it doesn't matter whether it's a Harappan site. It's the local deities, the temples, the shrines, etc., that are of, the ponds, as they said, that is of importance. So unless and until, what is happening, what I was also trying to flag is that even if you look at the way the legislative acts have changed from 1904 to 1958 to 2010 and to 2016, it is now basically from, at least in 1958, there was still the possibility of the village headman having some power. Now it is becoming, first it moved to the National Monuments Authority, first Director General, then you have another body, National Monuments Authority, and now central government. So the central government can do anything. And they don't really care about the local voices. And globally, the trend is that unless and until you involve the local communities, you cannot preserve any. And this is the same for national parks. You have to have a conversation going with the local communities there and then negotiate and work out ways.
Hello. I think my question has already been answered though. I mean, in particular at Rakhigarhi, I mean, what were the basic arguments from people's side? I mean, there were 200 families that were supposed to,
No, they are being forced. They have been issued these letters. They said, we are not going to move. You can do whatever you feel like. They have all come together and decided there's no question of them moving out. So there is now a deadlock. And there is no way the ASI can forcefully, it will become a major issue if they forcibly lift those people out. That's not the way forward. So somewhere you have to sit down, you have to talk to them, but the ASI doesn't do that. The central government doesn't do that. So what will happen is that from next year, they will not allow the archaeologists to even enter. No excavations, finished. Because they will just form a blockade.
what has been the role of KHAP there? I mean, how did that mobilization happen?
Because that is the way they function there. No? Everything, the local issues are decided at the level of the KHAP panchayats. So 17 villages come under these 12 KHAPs. And they got together, the KHAP leaders, and they decided that we are not going to move.
I just want to extend his question. So I wanted to know if, what is your take on finding a solution to the situation in Rakhigarhi? So,
What is well, nobody's consulting me, so I can have any take. It doesn't really matter.
I mean, but if the
But
situation is
my,
to be
my
solved.
take is that it is not reasonable to expect people to move, to relocate. In this case, dams and all, there is a much larger utility substitute to some, though even that, I have issues with that. But in this case, I really, like say, even at Indor Khera, I mean, ideally as an archaeologist, I would love to have all the mounds and I can go on excavating all of them. But that's not the reality. And we have to come to grips with reality. So even here, I think they should sit down and they should negotiate and they should let the villagers stay where they are. There is, like, one of the things, one of the challenges that we had to face with is that when we started this project on Indor Khera, we were interested in excavating a small urban center because we felt that while a lot is known about urbanism in the Harappan period, not that much is known about the early historic urban centers. There have been a fair amount of urban centers that have been excavated in the Gangetic area, but mostly these excavations have been what is called vertical excavations. So you just go down one deep trench. We wanted to excavate a larger area, but given our resources and our team members and all that, so we did a survey of this region and we decided that Indor Khera seemed possible. It was located close enough to Delhi and Aligarh where we were based. But what they also said is that you really can't do horizontal excavation in most of these mounds in North India because there are present-day villages on top of these mounds. But even at Indor Khera, like I said, that while 2/3 of the area is occupied, there is still that 1/3 area, which is a common land where they have their dung heaps and then they also have their animals, etc. You could still find space. So when we excavated, there was no conflict because at first they were very scared. They thought that we are excavating and they will have to, and you know, when they watched us bringing out our tapes and we were measuring, etc., they thought that they're all going to be evicted. And we had to actually assure them that there's no question. We will only excavate in those areas that are vacant. And in any case, as an archaeologist, you're not supposed to excavate the entire village. You have to leave major portions for the generations in the future with better techniques, with other questions in mind. So you excavate a very small area. And even about this site at Rakhigarh, we know so much about Harappa. There is really no need to go in excavating the whole mound. And there are areas I've gone and visited which are not occupied. Limit your excavation to that. Don't do this. That would be my solution. You cannot ask people to move out where they've lived there for hundreds of years. Even if it is an important site like Harappa, and I'm an archaeologist and it's very dear to me, but even then I wouldn't say that this is the way out. No. Yeah.
The amendment that you showed us,
Yeah.
that was about how in the interest of public works infrastructure, even monuments with heritage value can be, we lose priority status. I mean, that seems like a very sinister move. It's something outside of this discussion, right?
Yeah.
What is the context behind the emergence of that clause and who is behind it and what might be its fate from what you can guess in the parliament? It's still a bill. It's not yet been passed.
2016 is basically where essentially what they're doing, like this issue came up when, yeah. There are, near Agra, there are certain monuments and they want to build a road very close to it. And it comes within that 100-meter thing. In order to circumvent that, they have included this clause. And the central government can then overrule this 100-meter clause. That is the reason. And what I was also trying to show through these various legislative acts, it's always about preserving, conserving the monument. What about the people? What about the communities that are associated with these monuments? That is never there. And this is basically coming from the colonial period, which is continuing. Whereas globally, the trend has been completely reversed. But we still seem to be stuck in that framework.
Yeah, that point is, you're right, looking at it like that. But I think I was echoing something that Chandan was thinking of also. You mentioned the legislation which allows you to have a road go through a particular
That is the
area.
2016 amendment. That's what they're trying to
So
bring.
I was thinking of Yogi and the Taj, So it can definitely be used for
It can be used for
activities
that,
of that kind.
also. It can be used for
Yeah.
that also. And that sinister, it could well be. I mean, I wouldn't put it past them. It's possible. But it's just that, you know, in the case of Taj Mahal, I feel it's unlikely because it is a major revenue generator, major revenue. So there is no way they will touch that.
No, I didn't mean it literally.
Yeah, but
I
yes.
meant it can be used
Yes,
for various.
yeah, for various kinds of things. Yeah, definitely. Also to bring down more monuments that are inconvenient. They can do anything in the name of larger public works, infrastructure, etc. That is possible. With this clause, you can do it. I mean, there was some, I think, 2 pieces in the newspaper, but I don't think the Parliament, I think they are too bogged down by many other issues than to worry about this. Hemant, you have a question? Yeah.
So I think I learned a lot today, but you know, coming from an American experience of having excavated in Native American sites and in Mexico, which is a completely different country with different sort of cultural rules and all that, I think I agree with you completely. We are regressing in the colonial mold itself. Are there, like taking off on what Chandan was talking about, is there opposition to these kinds of rules? Are institutions like AKTC, INTAC, are they actually thinking of different ways of doing things, or are they just doing because they have a space and the government sort of has this PPP, public-private partnership is there a voice within them to do things differently?
Definitely, that's what I showed, that AKTC has involved the community and that has been a real success. But that is one Humayun's tomb and the neighboring area we're talking of. Whereas as a country, there are thousands and thousands. AKTC is not going to enter into all those.
And how many archaeologists do these trusts actually employ?
See, they are mainly working with conservation architects, not so much archaeologists, because they are into conserving of monuments, Mughal period monuments.
Yeah. So
They're
in a
not
way,
excavating.
so in a way, it seems that the role of archaeologists is not really well defined with these things happening in our contemporary times. As you said, we want to excavate, we need to know the histories of these places. We want to really, a lot of us sincere archaeologists want to have the communities get involved. But the role that we can play at a slightly larger level seems to be extremely sort of discombobulated almost.
Hemant, one of the things that is coming is that supposing you apply for funding if you want to excavate, and if you are especially looking for international funding, then one of the clauses is that you have to involve the community. And therein, you know, that like, say, we were not bound by that, and we really didn't do much, I mean, short of, you know, informal conversations. But that will force you, and in fact, even with AKTC, this is one of the mandates that you have to involve the community, and you have to do some amount of dissemination to the public, and particularly involving school children. That's part of the funding. But that doesn't work in India because that is not a clause when you apply for funding, say, from ASI or ICHR. There is no such thing. You're not bound by it.
For instance, in the US, if you apply for a National Science Foundation grant, you have to have a separate section in your grant saying broader public outreach.
Exactly, outreach.
It is mandatory.
Also issues of ethics, whereas we don't have any of that here. Yeah.
When you mentioned that there are cases when the local communities may not know the significance of the site, in which case, and they're unwilling to, so what has been the experience in, in attempts at trying to get them to appreciate it? That process, how many instances of that have you encountered and how do they usually pan out?
See, firstly, at Indor Khera, we can't treat them as a homogenized community. I mean, there are people amongst them who realize that there is a deeper past here. But for most of them, I think they are so involved in their daily struggles that this is something, I mean, somewhere it also has to do with this, and that's why I feel that unless and until we have a more sort of development and education that awareness is going to come. And if we, because like say you are saying about the US or even Mexico or in Europe, it is partly related to their economies. In a place like Indor Khera, where you're just struggling with your basic survival, where are you going to think about preserving or even the past? That's not really at the forefront. So that's also the problem in our country. I mean, first, I think the basic issue is poverty and livelihoods and hunger.
You're talking about issues that one of my students read about forests, and I said, yeah, eminent domain, all kinds of concerns. There is convergence happening here. And there is a language of participation coming up. But we also know that participation has its own tyrannies, and we can't pick and choose half a chance.
Exactly. So for some things, when it comes to gender issues or other things, caste problems, we don't have anything to do. But here it is Khap Panchayat, which is saying, well, you can't do this. So of course there are huge. I mean, that's not an ideal way of dealing with situations. Khap Panchayat entering.
Yes. Yes. But nonetheless, they make for sustainable resources.
Yes.
Yeah. So you make an argument for sustainability using those frameworks, and they're participating.
Yeah.
In the sense that you're taking consultation and so on. So I'm on the one hand very excited that this is the field where now it is resonating with other questions and approaches. Your methodology will have to completely change. You see, when I began field research in my area in 1984, the assumptions you made about what you could do, how you could behave, what you could expect from people are very different from what it is now. I was working within a much more paternalistic setup than today. So all that is changing. But I still think we are on the horns of a dilemma. We are getting aware of the dilemma.
Yes, but we really are not very clear. I mean, if you ask me, I'm also not very clear as to how. I mean, that's why I said way forward to question marks. It's only now that I'm grappling with these issues and wondering how do we then, and how do I sort of, I'm sort of still nearing, I've done like 30 years, but it's for my students who have to figure this out.
One more question, then we stop.
Archaeology, where you mentioned that even the education is playing a lot of role. So the question I have is there any space that allows interaction between archaeologists, education practitioners, and also for those who are still at the very beginner stage, but who want to contribute to the cause of conservation of heritage? So are there any projects that are offering such space for education practitioners?
Well, there is a Sharma Institute, and there it is also happening because that's part of the funding clause, which is based in Chennai. There is Shanti Pappu who is involved, and then Smriti Haricharan, I think you could talk to her. She has a project, and she's working with school children in around Nias and trying to get them involved, and they're having various workshops, etc. And there's going to be a workshop even in July at Nias, where and people from different vernacular backgrounds who are interested in these issues will be coming. So now these initiatives are just about starting.
And I think we have to go to conclusion. I want to thank Supriya for finding time to come here. We have actually learned and enjoyed ourselves enormously. Thank you.